Lovely to be here with you all. So I'm not a dementia researcher. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, but what I'm going to do over the next 45 minutes or so is give you a tour of the research we're doing in my lab at UCL and end with some reflections on how I think this is the science of self-awareness, the science of metacognition, does have widespread clinical implications for a number of different psychiatric and neurological disorders. But I will start with a story. This is the story of Stanislav Petrov. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Soviet Air Defense Forces in the 1980s at the height of nuclear tensions between the US and Russia. And he was on duty one morning in September 1983 when the warning systems that said he was under incoming missile attack were going off in his command center. And his instructions at the time were to pass that message up the chain as fast as possible so that a preemptive strike could be launched. But instead of doing that, he alone decided to pause and wait and reflect on what he was seeing and think, actually, this could be a false alarm. And in doing so, as this Guardian obituary suggests, he's perhaps one of the few individuals who can lay claim to averting single-handedly a nuclear disaster. Now, why do I tell this story? Well, I think it shows us the value of seeing the world in shades of grey rather than in black or white. Petrov had the self-awareness to reflect on whether what he was seeing was real or potentially illusory. He could think to himself, am I being fed here true or potentially false information? And this is not an easy thing to be able to do. As philosophers over the years have told us, distinguishing appearance from reality is not an easy thing. This goes all the way back to Plato and his allegory of the prisoners trapped in the cave, mistaking the shadows on the wall for what's really out there. And we now know from psychology and neuroscience that we're all, in some sense, trapped in our own view of the world, our own illusions of what is out there. One of my heroes of experimental psychology, the British psychologist Richard Gregory, illuminated this in beautiful experiments that didn't need statistics to tell you what was going on. They just hit you with the force of the demonstration. This is one of his demos. This is the hollow face illusion. What you're seeing here is a mask of a human face rotating in 3 dimensions. And what most people will see is the inner concave side of the mask suddenly seems to pop out towards you in 3 dimensions, looks convex. Very hard not to see that. And the explanation for this illusion is that we are so used to seeing faces pointing out towards us that expectation, that prior, overrides any more subtle cues such as shape or shading to the real depth of the mask. And Gregory had lots of examples like this one. And what these kind of demonstrations tell us is that, in a sense, the brain is trying to build a model of what is out there. It's not fed the information directly. We have to infer reality. And this is a mix of our prior beliefs and also the incoming sensory data. And this is kind of similar, actually, to how a scientist builds models of our data in all different types of domains. Imagine you're a climate scientist and you're trying to build a model of the Earth's weather systems. The model you end up with is an approximation of reality. It's not a faithful copy of reality. And this feature of scientific model building underpinned this quip from the statistician George Box, who said that all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think this is quite a useful analogy for what the brain is doing. The brain is building mostly useful models of the world. If they weren't useful, then we would always be falling over and making mistakes and not able to navigate our environments. And yet, even though they're mostly useful, they can sometimes be misleading, as the experiments of Gregory shows. So the question we have in our lab is, to what extent can people gain insight or self-awareness into the extent to which their models of the world go awry? And we know many cases in which this process can get derailed. Cases of hallucinations and delusions are paradigmatic cases in which the brain's models of the world have become disconnected from external reality. Even in otherwise healthy brains, it's remarkably easy to convince people that things happened in their childhood that never really did. These are famous experiments by the American psychologist Elizabeth Loftus. What this tells us is that memory, just like perception, is not a videotape. It's not just faithfully reflecting reality. It's a reconstruction. We're constantly reconstructing our past and constantly imagining our futures. And sometimes that can diverge from reality. And more generally, things like conspiracy theories and our voracious appetite for seeing patterns in data tell us that sometimes this model building process can go into overdrive and cause us to become divorced from reality. So the question is then, this is the question really that illuminates most of the work that we do in my lab, is how can we recognize when we might be wrong? How can we distinguish appearance from reality? How can we gain insight into when this model building process might go awry? And this is a question that people have been puzzled about for a long time. It used to be thought this kind of self-awareness, this kind of self-knowledge was just logically impossible. This is the French philosopher Auguste Comte saying that true self-awareness is not, the brain can't do this. You'd have to somehow cut it in two. The same organ that is thinking and the organ that is observing itself thinking is the same thing. So how can it possibly do that? The thinking individual cannot cut himself in two. He exchanged letters on this point with the British empiricist philosopher John Stuart Mill. And Mill took a different tack. He said, well, hang on a minute. We can think of self-awareness as the brain recursively, or they didn't talk about the brain back then, but they talked about the mind recursively applying itself to its own thoughts and actions. He says here, we think about what we've done once the act is over. We can, in a sense, watch ourselves acting in the world and reflect to ourselves, hang on, have I got the right picture here? This simple fact shoots down Mr. Comte's entire argument. And philosophers since Mill have kind of taken this further and suggested that what's perhaps unique about the human mind compared to other animal minds is that we're particularly good at this recursive process of reflecting on our own outputs, if you like, our own thoughts, feelings, and actions. What Hofstadter calls the strange loop, that we have this kind of loopy process where we don't just think and act, but we then think about our own thinking and acting and so on and so forth. And this is what psychologists call metacognition, so this broad umbrella term which refers to being able to think about your own thinking, decisions, percepts, memories, beliefs, and so on. We have some kind of internal check and balance on the accuracy of other aspects of cognition. We do, in some sense, know when we might have been led astray. And the question that underpins the work in my lab is the bottom three here. How do we study this? How can we start quantifying, using the tools of psychology and neuroscience, how metacognition works and why it might go awry? Okay? So this is part of, as I said at the start, this is part of the broader field of cognitive neuroscience. And cognitive neuroscience is this subfield of neuroscience which is at the intersection with psychology. So how the mind works in biological and increasingly in computational terms. So a lot of what we do day to day is we think about experiments that we can do in combination with brain imaging to expose the neural correlates of cognitive and metacognitive processes. But we're also increasingly engaged day to day in building theoretical models. So theoretical models written down in computer code that try and simulate the kind of data we get, either behavioral data or brain imaging data. So what I'm going to talk about for the remainder of the talk is kind of split into these different sections. I'll start with a brief primer on how we can actually start taking these more abstract philosophical concepts of self-awareness and measure them in the lab. Tell you about some data on the psychological structure of metacognitive judgments. I'll then zoom into some recent work we've done on reality monitoring, how we distinguish reality from imagination. And then I'll end with some thoughts on how these distortions in metacognition might help us understand subjective symptoms that you might be interested in the course of your research on dementia. So when we're studying metacognition in the lab, what we're interested in is trying to create a minimal setting where we can expose people's judgments about their own cognitive or behavioural performance. And the way we've been doing that for a few years now is by taking minimal models of cognitive processing in the form of perceptual decision-making. So perceptual decision-making refers to asking people to make simple judgments about stimuli we can present on the computer screen, and we can control them in a way that allows us to get a tight handle on how difficult that is for the subject. So we might ask you, for instance, is this Gabor patch tilted to the left or tilted to the right? Is this patch of noise, does this contain a face or not? Does this patch of flickering dots, is it going to the left or to the right? So these are very simple decisions about perceptual stimuli, but they're useful for us because we can then build out an experiment where we ask you not only about your judgment about the world, so that's a perceptual judgment, but we can also ask you a metacognitive judgment, what we call a type 2 judgment. How confident are you that you got that decision about the world correct? And so this is our experimental probe of metacognition. And we can do this across a range of different experiments and so on, but this is really the core of the experimental technique we use in the lab. Now, when we have lots of these confidence judgments over time, we can then start to build up a statistical picture of how good your metacognition is. Now, the intuition here is that if you're the kind of person who is more confident when you're actually correct and less confident when you're wrong, then you have a high degree of what we call metacognitive efficiency, which is how effectively you are able to monitor and introspect about your performance on that primary task. Importantly, the primary task doesn't actually matter so much. All we want for a primary task is a task that's difficult for you and you make some errors on it, and then we can ask how well your metacognitive judgments monitor your performance on that task. Here's some actual data from an experiment like this. The first few trials of an experiment from a single participant in the lab. And what you see here is on the top row is their accuracy of the judgment. Sometimes it's correct, it's a 1. Other times it's incorrect, it's a 0. And we have the subject's confidence ratings. Here we collected them on a sliding scale from 1 to 6, but we use various different kinds of metacognitive judgment scales. And what I always find quite striking about this is that even though essentially the stimulus on every trial was pretty much identical in this experiment, sometimes people are very confident that they were correct, and other times they're much less confident. And so we can then ask, well, do people actually know when they're right and when they're wrong? Do those confidence estimates actually map onto something about their objective performance? That's really the key question that we ask with a lot of the analyses we do of these kind of data. Now, there's lots of ways to analyze that. What we often do is fit statistical models derived from a branch of psychology known as signal detection theory. The details of this don't matter so much, but essentially what we're trying to do is quantify the overlap. So if you just look at the right-hand side here, between the confidence distributions you give when you're actually correct and the confidence distributions you give when you're actually wrong. So if you have good metacognition, as I mentioned earlier, these distributions should be well separated. You should know when you're right and know when you're wrong. Yeah, they should be distinguishable. Whereas if you have poorer metacognition, like this guy on the top here, then those distributions are more smushed together because you're just less able yourself to know whether you are right or wrong. And we can quantify that with a statistic that we call meta d prime. It's a single number. And we can compare that to your d prime, which is your performance on the primary task. So we get these numbers out of this analysis approach, where meta d prime is how effectively your confidence is tracking your underlying performance on the task. And the ratio of because these are in the same units, we can take a ratio measure, which is nice, because that tells us something about how good your metacognition is relative to your actual performance on the underlying task. And it should be around 1 if self-monitoring is intact, because these things are in the same units. And what we find is that in the general population, this is aggregated across many, many subjects in the group. Indeed, we do find that the average population metacognition is good. In a sample of healthy volunteers in the lab at UCL, the ratio is around 1 on average. But we also find systematic individual differences. So people on the right-hand side here of this distribution, some people have acute awareness of when they're getting things right or wrong, whereas other people have limited insight into their performance. They're doing the task just as well, but their self-awareness is poorer. They just have less awareness of when they're wrong and when they're right. And what we've done in a series of studies recently is asked, is this a general characteristic of an individual, or is it somewhat idiosyncratic to the task that they're doing? And what we find is that it does seem to be a relatively general characteristic. A bit like IQ is a relatively general psychological characteristic, we find that metacognition is a relatively general psychological characteristic. I'll give you some data on this. So what we can do is ask this kind of question, give you two different tasks, slightly different stimuli, and we can ask, does having good metacognition on one task predict having good metacognition on another task? Turns out that even though your performance on two tasks might be uncorrelated, people's metacognition is significantly correlated across the two tasks. That suggests it's relatively, it's not tied to any one particular stimulus. And we can even go further than that and ask, well, now across not even just different stimuli, but different setups entirely. This was a study done in collaboration with colleagues in Grenoble in France, hence why the stimuli in French. We can give people a memory task, a general knowledge quiz, like how high is Mont Blanc, executive function style task, a perception task, and in all of them we can ask you, how confident are you in your judgments about these stimuli? And we can model the covariance in metacognition across the four tasks. And what we find is there's a substantial domain general component. So just like if you measure your IQ on one task, it'll be correlated with IQ on another task. If we measure your metacognition on one task, it tends to be correlated with your metacognition on another task. We've just recently done this with colleagues also in Denmark, very similar setup, slightly different tasks, and again, you get very similar results. So if people have good metacognition on one task, they also tend to have good metacognition on another very different task. So that suggests it's a relatively general psychological capacity. Now, just one little note, this is more an insider point, but there's debate in our field. It's been rumbling along for the past almost 10 years now about some people like to think it's not a general characteristic. We think we have data to think it is a general characteristic. We think one of the reasons why this debate exists is that previous studies have often underestimated correlations in metacognition between different tasks. And this is more of a statistical point, that if you have a more appropriate generative model, and this is a simulation study that we did recently, showing that if we simulate data with a particular correlation effect size on the x-axis here, then some methods underestimate that in simulation, and other methods can recover it properly in simulation. And so this is just more of a general point. Whenever you're applying statistical methods to your data, doing simulation studies is really useful because it allows you to actually understand the limits of your method. And I personally think, and many others do as well now, that we're kind of resolving this debate because we've realized that part of this debate is methodological rather than psychological. I've mentioned IQ a couple of times. I won't go into this for the sake of time, but what's interesting is that we're not just picking up another aspect of IQ here. In big studies with thousands of individuals, we've, not only our lab, but other labs as well, has shown that this metacognitive parameter can be distinguished from other aspects of executive function, such as traditional measures of fluid intelligence, at least in the normal range. It starts to break down when you get to more extremes of the distribution. And what that colloquially suggests, and I think a lot of us can intuitively kind of feel this, is that someone can actually be very smart but have poor self-awareness of their skill and ability in a particular domain, and vice versa. Okay, so that's the psychology, but how is the brain doing this? How are we able to monitor and introspect about our performance on a variety of different tasks? Well, one powerful way of thinking about this is that you can kind of identify two different broad modes of brain processing. One is about the world, about perceiving and memorizing things in the world, building a model of our environment, using that to navigate, and so on and so forth. And the other mode of processing is about ourselves, right? About our own actions, our own thoughts, our own feelings. And I should say, actually, just because this sometimes gets confused, but in the world bit here, I'm including the body. Right? So sometimes people tie self to body. Here I'm talking about thinking about our own minds, our own mental states. So bodily perception is fascinating, but that is, for me, being at the moment pushed into the world part. And here I'm talking about how does the brain engage in processing judgments about your own judgments about the world, this metacognitive aspect. And the idea is that this self-directed processing relies heavily on estimating a degree of confidence or certainty that other cognitive and perceptual processes have unfolded as they should. And that allows us to then doubt ourselves, because if we attach a degree of confidence to, say, a memory being true, or to, say, a percept being accurate, or, for instance, being able to complete some motor action like kicking a ball into a goal, we certainly get this ability to start doubting ourselves as well, because if we infer that we have low confidence in the ability to kick the ball into the goal, then we can say to ourselves, hang on, my skill is not good enough here, I need to learn more, I need to go and get more coaching, and so on. So confidence is a key variable of interest for models of metacognition. And when I got into this field a few years ago, we started doing some brain imaging where we were interested in how people are forming simple metacognitive judgments. So the way we set this up was we asked people to engage in perceptual decisions, this time about whether a noisy image had a face or a house embedded in it. And then on some of those perceptual decisions, they had to go on to make a metacognitive judgment, a confidence estimate about their decision, and in others, they just engaged in a low-level control task. And what we found is that when you engaged in metacognitive judgments, you activated a subset of regions within the prefrontal cortex, most notably the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex and the lateral frontopolar cortex. And we've seen these regions pop up again and again in studies of metacognition since. Now, these regions don't only elevate their activity when you are engaged in a metacognitive judgment, they also correlate with the judgment you give. They change their activity profile according to whether you're more or less confident in your previous decision. So knowing where things happen in the brain is obviously a useful first step, but it's really a starting point rather than an end point. And what we've been doing since then is a variety of different experiments to try and understand what are the functions of these prefrontal subregions that support metacognition. One helpful way of probing this has been to design new tasks where rather than just asking people for their confidence in a previous decision, we've injected new information after they make their decision, but before they rate their confidence. And this is a useful paradigm for us because this allows us to dissociate out evidence that's contributing to your judgment about the world. So in this case, this is a random dot motion stimulus like the one I showed you earlier. Are the dots going to the left or to the right? That's a judgment about the world. But now, after you make your initial left-right decision, I can give you a new look at the stimulus. And that is now new information about my decision about the world. It allows me to evaluate whether I've actually made a good or bad decision. So this is information I can use to update my confidence in my judgment about the world. And this kind of paradigm, what we call the post-decisional evidence paradigm, allows us to then probe what these brain regions are doing in relation to metacognition. I won't go into the details of this because it takes a while to explain, but we can also write down simple mathematical models of how confidence is being updated based on this new information. And these models have both world-directed parts. They accumulate evidence about the direction of the dots, for instance, but they also have self-directed parts. They accumulate evidence about whether my choice was a good one or a bad one. And it turns out that these two parts of the model make specific predictions about the signatures we should see in our brain imaging data. We can derive qualitative patterns for what we should see. This is all in simulation for the world-directed part, and qualitative patterns in simulation for what we should see in the self-directed part. And to cut a long story short, we see these subregions in the prefrontal cortex, the dorsal anterior cingulate on the left-hand side here, and the frontopolar regions on the right-hand side here. These show these qualitative signatures of self-directed processing. So it's kind of isolating the function of these regions as processing information not only about our environment, but also about our own thoughts and actions in relation to that environment. And as this slightly technical summary says here, posterior-anterior gradient within the prefrontal cortex. So when you go from the dorsal anterior cingulate forward into the frontopolar cortex, you start to see this shift from coding confidence in a world to a self-directed frame of reference. It's almost as if as you go further forward in the brain, things get more self-related. We've also done a little bit of work to probe to what extent are these codes for metacognition in the prefrontal cortex general or specific to a particular task. And this echoes the investigation of whether this capacity is psychologically domain general or specific. We can do this by applying machine learning methods to the pattern of brain activity we get from these fMRI scans, and asking whether after I train, for instance, a classifier to predict how confident you are in one task, like a perceptual task, can I use that trained classifier to then predict how confident you are in the memory task, and vice versa? If I can do that in a particular brain region, that's evidence that that brain region carries a relatively general code for metacognition. And it turns out that is what we can do. So the yellow areas here, if you look at this part of the slide here, the yellow areas are ones that carry this relatively general code for metacognition. It's not tied to any one particular task. Okay, so far I've talked about metacognition for perceptions and memories and general knowledge. These are all things that have what philosophers call truth conditions, that they can be evaluated by someone else. Like, I can tell you, no, that was wrong. I know the answer was left, and you said it was right. But we often engage in decisions and actions about more subjective things. In fact, that's probably what dominates most of our daily lives. And we've been interested in to what extent do we also then engage in metacognition and self-reflection about these more subjective choices. Things like, what should I have for dinner tonight? Which job should I take? Who should I marry? All these kind of more subjective choices where I can't tell you whether that's right or wrong. But you yourself might have a sense of whether you're making good or bad choices. So to study this, we've been working, this is a colleague of mine, Benedetto De Martino. He's a professor at UCL, behavioural economist. We've been studying simple choices about what people would like to eat for a snack. And we make this incentive compatible because they come to the lab hungry and they know that they're going to have to stay for an hour after the scan, and the only thing they get to eat is one of the things they've chosen in this task phase. And what we did was ask people, so lots of economists have done lots of these kind of studies about value-based choice, which snacks you'd like to eat and so on. But we added this confidence estimate. So we asked people to evaluate now not confidence in being correct, because there is no notion of correctness here. I can't tell you that you should choose the kettle chips rather than the Milky Way. But we can ask you, how confident are you that you yourself made a good decision for you, right? And what we found was we then could ask, do people have insight into making poor subjective choices? And we defined poor subjective choices here as choices that went against the amount of money you were willing to pay for each snack. Okay, so if you chose the thing that you yourself subjectively valued less. And we found that that was indeed the case. So the way we can analyze these data is we can plot a choice function which relates the difference in value between the two items to whether you choose that item. And you get this nice sigmoidal function. So the more you value the right-hand side item over the left-hand side item, the more likely you are to choose it. But this choice function is steeper when you have more confidence in your choice. So what that shows us is that confidence is tracking something about the accuracy of the choice, but now it's not objective accuracy, because there is no notion of objective accuracy. Now it's accuracy with respect to your own subjective value of that snack item. That's one example subject. This is the average. And we also did some brain imaging to show that the same brain areas that we identified in the studies of perception and memory were also engaged when people who were engaged in metacognition about these value-based subjective choices. I think the expansion of metacognition into this more subjective domain is quite interesting because it tells us that metacognition is tracking something over and above some arbitrary definition of correctness. And people have increasingly been talking in the field about metacognition tracking something about self-consistency. So people tend to express lower confidence when their choice fails to align with what they would have chosen on another occasion. So the idea here is that metacognition is not evaluating things just in one moment in time. Instead, it's kind of saying to yourself, OK, the reason I have low confidence in that choice is because, in general, that doesn't really fit with the values that I want to apply in my daily life. And that's consistent with metacognitive judgment having this counterfactual aspect. OK, so just to kind of summarize this part, so we can isolate in the lab a parameter that governs metacognitive efficiency, which is relatively domain general, and it requires representing subjective uncertainty about decisions or actions you've either taken or will take in the future. And we find within the brain that a posterior-anterior gradient within the human prefrontal cortex supports these more abstract metacognitive computations, allowing you to recursively estimate things about yourself. Now, I want to zoom in a bit on an area of metacognition that we've started to move some of the work in the lab into. And that's something that's perhaps deeper than monitoring our decision-making, and this is going to really the heart of whether we're able to distinguish something about external reality from internal imagination. Now, the reason this is a difficult thing to do is that we know from work in neuroscience that we essentially reuse internal resources for perceiving the outside world for when we're imagining things internally. So the brain areas in the ventral visual stream overlap. Even at the single neuron level, this is a recent study came out just a couple of months ago, showing that when you have electrodes implanted in the ventral temporal cortex, this is for patients undergoing epilepsy surgery, if you ask people to imagine simple objects, they reactivate the same neurons that are actually driven by the presentation of those real objects on the screen. Similar neural resources involved in both perception and imagination. So this raises this really deep question about is the problem of what we call reality monitoring. How does the brain know when some sort of sensory activity is reflecting the external world or is just reflecting my internal imagination? This is a metacognitive question, because to make that decision, you have to somehow distinguish appearance from reality. And this is a question we've been trying to answer over the past few years with a really brilliant postdoc in my lab, Nadine Dijkstra, who's now just setting up her own lab at UCL to focus on this question. And what we did here was build on existing work that's looked at experimenting with the imagination in the lab. This was a very early study by a pioneering female psychologist working at Harvard in the early 1900s, Mary Cheves West Perkey. And she brought people into her lab and asked them to imagine simple stimuli on a screen. Things like imagine an apple, imagine a banana, and so on. And what she did was fade in a feature of the thing that they were trying to imagine on the screen surreptitiously without the participant being aware of it. So if I asked you to imagine an apple, she might then fade in the color red onto the screen. And then she asked people what they saw. And people, by and large, were unaware that she was messing around with the screen. They said things like, wow, I've never experienced such rich imagery before, but I've never really tried. Or if I hadn't known I was imagining, I would have thought it was real. So she's kind of able to mess around with our reality monitoring circuitry in this clever way by combining perception and imagination on a single trial. Now, this was a qualitative study, but we wanted to revisit this with modern psychophysics. And so we set up an experiment where we asked people to imagine simple stimuli embedded in patches of flickering noise like this one. So we might ask you to look at this patch of noise and try and imagine these left-tilted stripes, what we call a grating, appearing as vividly as possible, as if it were really there. Okay? So I want us to try this together. I'm going to show you a patch of flickering noise, and I want you to try and imagine that left-tilted set of stripes. Just you can have a look at the stripes again. So you're ready to imagine that. See if you can imagine that in your mind's eye, looking at that patch of noise. And then I'm going to ask you a question about it. Okay, ready? Whoa, there we go. Okay, so was a stimulus actually presented on the screen, or was anything you saw only in your imagination? Hands up for stimulus. Okay, yeah, most of you saw the stimulus then. So that was relatively high. There was a stimulus there towards the end. It was ramping up. It was relatively high contrast. But what we do in the actual experiment is we titrate that down to your individual threshold. And so hopefully you get the sense that this is not an easy question, right? So if you are able to vividly imagine a grating on the screen, it's actually quite difficult to know whether it's actually just in your imagination or actually on the screen. So this was the setup of one of the first experiments we did. We asked people to imagine the grating on the screen, just like you just did, without any additional stimulus presented for the first few trials of the task. And then on a final critical combination trial, we would ask you whether an actual stimulus was presented or not. And on this final critical combination trial, we either presented a grating that was congruent, the same as the thing you're trying to imagine, or incongruent, so tilted in the opposite direction as the thing you're trying to imagine. And then we simply asked, how much do people confuse their perception for imagination on these kind of trials? What we found was that, similar to the Mercure results, perception and imagination became intermixed. So when people were in this congruent condition, they were more likely to say there was a real stimulus out there. It was almost as if the imagination they had of that stimulus was adding some evidence for a real stimulus actually being out there. But there was also a bidirectional interaction such that when we measured how vivid their imagery was, this is on the y-axis of this plot here, their imagery was particularly vivid on the trials where they also judged something as being real. It was almost as if the internal imagination, when it was really vivid, was interpreted as being a real stimulus, just like in the Mercure experiment. So what's going on here? Well, one idea is that actually people might be using the difference in vividness or detail between imagery and perception as a cue to figure out whether it's real or not. Because in general, imagery tends to be weaker and less vivid than real perception. This is not a new idea. It goes all the way back to David Hume, who says the idea or imagination of red, which we form in the dark, differs only in degrees of intensity, not in its actual nature, from the impression or perception of red that strikes our eye in the sunshine. So Hume's arguing for a quantitative rather than a qualitative difference between perception and imagination. We can write this idea down in a simple model where we have a common sensory neural population, for instance, in the ventral visual stream, that's driven both by perception and internally by imagery. And we can then compare the summed activity to some internal threshold. We call this the reality threshold. When the activity goes above that threshold, we say it's real. When it's below the threshold, we say it's imagined. Super simple model. But the nice thing about writing it down in equations is that we can then simulate what we should expect for our actual experiment. And when we do that, remember, these are the results we saw, the qualitative pattern of results we saw in our initial experiment. When we do that, we get a really nice match to the experimental data. And this was developed somewhat post hoc, but we can then generate out-of-sample tests for this model. And one test is what happens when you just take the stimulus away completely. Now, they still have to judge whether a stimulus is there or not, but there isn't a stimulus actually on the screen. And what our model predicts is that you should judge that a real stimulus is out there when your internal imagery is particularly vivid, because those are the trials that push you over this reality threshold for saying something's really out there. And when we ran that experiment, that's exactly what we saw, suggesting that the model might be on the right track. Now, we've also been more recently combining this with brain imaging with my colleague Peter Koch at the Phil in Queen Square. And what we did here was basically rerun that experiment, but now with many trials in combination with fMRI. And we were able to derive simulations from the model for what we should expect from a brain area signaling the extent to which something is likely to be real or just imagined. And we found that this qualitative signature was recapitulated in the bilateral ventral visual cortex, in the bilateral fusiform gyrus, these areas just here. So the strength of the signal here was tracking what our model predicted should be observed for a brain region signaling how vivid your experience was and whether or not you should think that is real or just imagined. We can also look at to what extent this is interpreted by downstream regions as reflecting reality or imagination. And there we see a slightly different profile. There we see areas in the prefrontal cortex, including those areas that we saw previously as involved in metacognition, so things like the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex. We see here activity shows a more binary profile. It encodes whether I say, on this trial things are real, or on this trial things are imagined, rather than a more continuous signal that's tracking how vivid my experience is. And we find a particularly strong role for the anterior insula, which shows strong coupling. So if we do connectivity analyses, we see heightened coupling between the fusiform gyrus on the left-hand side there and the anterior insula on trials where people have to judge whether something is real or imagined. So we think there's particularly interesting for future work looking at the relationship between anterior insula and the visual system, or the auditory system, for instance, might start allowing us to understand failures of reality monitoring, such as might underpin cases of hallucinations. Okay, so this is kind of our component model of reality monitoring at the moment. We've focused on this importance of tracking the reliability or strength of sensory activity, how confident you are in your percepts of the world, and using those confidence signals to judge whether something is likely to be real or imagined. We don't think this is the only thing going on. We've also started work, or Nadine has started work, looking at the extent to which people have cognitive control over their imagery, because that's another big difference between imagination and perception. We can, in some sense, control voluntarily what we imagine, but it's harder to control voluntarily what you perceive. Okay, so in the last, how am I doing for time? Last 10 minutes, perfect. Okay, good. So where are we taking this next? Well, one area we're getting particularly interested in is expanding the purview of metacognition research to, rather than focusing just on individual decisions or trials of an experiment at the bottom level of this hierarchy, like I've told you about in the work so far, we're getting interested in how people build more global estimates of their skills and abilities over longer time frames, such as understanding why do some people think they have a good memory and other people think they have a poor memory? Why do some people think they have good skill in a particular domain rather than others? This is all about building models of ourselves and our skills and abilities and capacities over more extended time frames. And one way of thinking about this is that metacognition is itself a dynamic hierarchical process that has multiple timescales to it. And with my colleague Marion Rouault, who's now was a postdoc in my group, she's now running her lab in Paris, we've been looking at experiments where we can start studying interactions between these levels, looking at how people update beliefs about their performance, not on individual trials, but maybe over many trials of a task, and occasionally probing these more global beliefs. And then we can start looking at how different factors affect those global beliefs about yourself. One thing we've done is, and I don't have time to show you the actual data here, this is more of a summary slide. We've also been able to combine that with brain imaging, where we've started to look at distinctions between brain areas that seem to be more local, in terms of local in time. So these are brain areas that are involved in monitoring whether you're making a mistake or how confident you feel in individual decisions and actions, and other regions that are maintaining these more long-term beliefs. And there are nice interactions between the two, which makes sense, because if I start making lots of errors on a task, then I might start want to update my belief about my general performance on that task. So this really feeds into this broader future directions for metacognition research, which is trying to expand the purview of the laboratory research, which has been incredibly useful in getting this field off the ground by giving us rigorous measures that we can actually study in the lab, but trying to connect those laboratory measures that can often be quite narrow to more broader real-world metacognitive beliefs that matter for people's lives. We're interested in exploring this in educational settings because there's been a long history of work in educational psychology which place a premium on metacognition, kids knowing what they do and do not know and using that meta-level knowledge to guide their own learning. There's been some lovely studies showing that that's just as, if not more important, than raw skill and ability, raw intellectual ability for navigating, for attainment, for getting good grades and being able to self-regulate your own learning and performance. For broader society, we've been interested in how metacognition is important for collaboration and resisting polarized beliefs. The idea here is that if you have metacognitive awareness about whether you are seeing the world in a particular way, then you can avoid getting trapped by particular worldviews and realize that other people might have equally valid perspectives on a particular problem. This is all a metacognitive phenomenon because it requires you to realize, just like at the start of the talk, that actually you might not have all the answers, and maybe it's useful to listen to other people. And with a climate scientist in Germany, Helen Fischer, we've been doing some work showing that there are particular domains of knowledge, particularly ones that are politically charged, like climate change research, that lead to these metacognitive failures. People might know just as much, but they make metacognitive errors in being overconfident in incorrect knowledge, and that can lead to these more polarized beliefs forming. In relation to technology, we're increasingly interested in the role of metacognition in AI systems and also in human-AI interaction. And then finally, in relation to medical and clinical applications, explaining lack of insight into people's symptoms. And I just want to end on this because I think this is where it nicely intersects with perhaps issues that you're all pursuing in your research on dementia. So we know that self-awareness is fragile, and this is perhaps no surprise given that what I showed you earlier in the talk, that self-awareness is a neurobiological phenomenon like any other. Just like we can lose motor function, we can lose memory function, we can lose metacognition, unfortunately. Altered self-awareness about cognitive and physical characteristics is a common feature of a wide range of psychiatric and neurological disorders. Clinicians often talk about anosognosia, or lack of insight. You can think of this as a lack of metacognitive acuity. This may underpin anecdotal reports that clinicians often complain about. We're doing some collaborations with neurosurgeons down at King's at the moment, and they often complain about the frontal lobe paradox, where they might excise a tumor in, say, more anterior sectors of the prefrontal cortex. And the patient then post-operatively passes all their neuropsychological tests with flying colors, but then they go home and they have problems. So what's going on there? Well, one idea is that they may have metacognitive problems in terms of being able to self-regulate and realize when they're making mistakes in particular areas of life. But those metacognitive aspects are not currently tapped into by classical neuropsychological workups. Here's a case study. This was a study that I did a few years ago now in collaboration with neurosurgeons at NYU Medical when I was a postdoc in New York. So we recruited patients into the study that we thought would be particularly prone to this frontal lobe paradox. They had tumor resections in the anterior sectors of the prefrontal cortex, these frontopolar areas that we know are particularly important for metacognition. We compared them to age and IQ matched control groups, both who had either a control group in the middle column here who had temporal lobe lesions of a similar size and a group of healthy controls without brain lesions. Now, what's important here, and you don't need to look at all the numbers, just I'll tell you the message from this slide, is that these three groups are matched as well as possible on neuropsychology, on working memory, on verbal memory, on set shifting, on full-scale IQ, on also age-matched. Basically, everything we could do to try and match the groups was matched. And it was to the level where the research assistants working with me on the study could not tell the difference between patients and controls in different groups just by interacting with them. But we thought we had reason to believe that the patients who had these prefrontal lesions would be impaired on metacognition on these laboratory tests. And so when we administered those tests, that's exactly what we saw. So this is performance, just first-order performance on the test. And we see no differences between the three groups on performance. But then when we look at metacognitive efficiency, that's substantially impaired in the anterior prefrontal group that we think are most prone to this frontal lobe paradox. And because this is a ratio measure, like I mentioned earlier, this is a big effect size drop. This is about a 50% drop on this metacognitive efficiency metric in relation to the two control groups. Now, we've since done work not only in patient populations, but also in the general population, looking at variability in structural and functional markers in relation to predictions of metacognitive ability. And we see systematic relationships with these subregions of the prefrontal cortex that can start explaining variance in how good your metacognition is and why that might be particularly prone to impairment in cases of brain damage. We've also started to work, this is a psychiatrist who was recently doing a PhD in my group, Andrew Williams, looking at benchmarking metacognition across the lifespan. Because if we want to know what's abnormal, we need to get a benchmark across different age groups. What Andy did was take these two tasks, perception and memory, and looked at both first-order performance on those two tasks across a stratified sample across the age range. This is the first-order performance aspect. But we also looked at metacognition. And what he saw was that, particularly at the global level, there was this tick down in confidence in performance across the age range. But there was no difference in, at least on these simple tasks, in primary performance. So this was a change in metacognition as a function of age. This is all cross-sectional. We'd love to do this longitudinally. And we're also getting interested in how this can start explaining more generally what we refer to as just subjective symptoms. Subjective symptoms about changes in underlying cognitive performance are prima facie metacognitive phenomena. These are beliefs about your own capacities, and this is what is going awry in functional disorders. So this was a collaboration with colleagues in Queen Square, where we again found that global metacognition was specifically impaired in the functional memory disorder patients. The underlying performance itself was not affected, but people's beliefs about themselves were getting formed in a slightly different way. And we think that this kind of work can start looking in a more mechanistic way to explain why people might have changes in subjective symptoms, subjective beliefs about their own capacities. So subjective symptoms could be thought of as distortions in global metacognition. So I will stop there just to say that we do have a couple of books that are useful entry points into this literature. It was mentioned earlier, this book aimed at a more general audience, Know Thyself, that hopefully is relatively accessible and straightforward to read. But if you're interested in applying the methods, we also have a textbook, an edited volume that takes you through different ways of studying metacognition in the lab in a variety of different domains and how you might then combine that with the neuroscience side of things. And just to end, thanking my lab, this is us on a retreat in the Cotswolds a couple of weeks ago. It was very lovely. The weather cooperated. And thanks to the funders. And thanks so much for the invite and for your attention.